Yes, let us continue. Please take a seat again. I am very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Amit Pinchevski. Amit is a senior lecturer in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His research interests are in philosophy of communication, media theory, focusing specifically on the ethical aspects of the limits of communication. That's a point we haven't spoken so much about yet. Also on the pathologies of communication. He is the author of By Way of Interruption, Levinas and the Ethics of Communication, and he has co-edited 2 books, namely Media Witnessing, Testimony in the Age of Mass Communication, and Ethics of Media. In 2011, he was a visiting scholar at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and in the following year, the recipient of the James Yaksa Scholar in Residence Award from the National Communication Ethics Conference. He had previously been elected as a member of the Young Scholars Forum in the Humanities and Social Sciences of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Between 2013 and 2015, he served as the chair of the Philosophy, Theory and Critique Division of the International Communication Association. He is currently involved in various research projects in Israel and Germany and the United States and Sweden. I'm very much looking forward to the lecture today, which is entitled The Third Witness, Testimony and Trauma from a Media Perspective.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for the introduction, and again, thank you for putting together this conference and inviting me and us all here to this very important, I think, event. And as you said, and as the title suggests, I will talk about the medium. I will talk about media. That will be my focus. Although I'm very much interested, of course, in the testimony, and you will, of course, see that. So while focusing on the medium, actually this is a tribute to Dori and his work. No one bears witness for the witness, wrote the poet Paul Celan. One way to describe the motivation behind projects for recording testimonies of Holocaust survivors is precisely to disprove Celan's admonition. Nowadays, we might take this motivation to be self-evident. But this was hardly the case. Okay. Sure. This was hardly, is it better? This was hardly the case when Dori Laub and Laurel Vlok, who was a television documentarian, first embarked on this idea in the late 1970s. The two initiated the Holocaust Survivors Film Project, which later became the Fortnow Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University, which we mentioned. It is hard to imagine contemporary memory of the Holocaust without the prevalence of what Jeffrey Hartman, who was the director of the Yale Archive for many years, aptly termed as video testimony, in one word, video testimony. This distinctive genre, which could be described as a cross between a television interview, oral history, and a psychoanalytic session, is now almost synonymous with Holocaust testimony itself. The Yale Archive was also the context of a seminal book, also mentioned, Testimony, Crises of Witnessing in Literature, Psychoanalysis, and History, published in 1992, co-authored by Laub and Shoshana Feldman, a book that founded a new discourse of trauma and testimony. Its key contribution, arguably, lies in theorizing the importance of an addressable other, in restoring the listening and responding functions of testimony, in short, in witnessing. Today, I would like to propose a slightly different perspective on testimony, a perspective never directly considered by Laub, but one that is nevertheless fundamental to the entire testimony project. A media perspective of testimony involving the technical conditions at the basis of video testimony. I suggest that audiovisual media constitute the third witness on the testimony scene, a technical holding environment, if you will, that bears witness to the second witness witnessing the first witness. Media as third witness is neither supplementary nor external to the witnessing process between speaker and listener, but rather constitutive of it, indeed its condition of possibility. I further suggest that the way trauma is understood and conceptualized in the testimony discourse owes much to what we might call videography, to the audiovisual inscription system that captures the performance of trauma through and upon the process of testimony. Now, employing a media perspective to testimony involves a gestalt shift. What is background becomes foreground, and what is taken for granted is precisely what demands explication. Media have the tendency to disappear once at work. Like the background, they are what allow other things to show up. It is therefore important to disclose what might be reduced mistakenly to technicalities. First and foremost, media do not simply handle pre-existing content, as though transmitting, processing, or storing what is already out there. Rather, media provide the conditions for the emergence of a certain type of content. Media give rise to the content they so handle. Such is also the case with audiovisual media that make the production of survivors' testimonies possible. The video camera, videotape recording, and the archiving and dissemination possibilities that audiovisual technology offers. Despite the focus on technology, this is hardly a technical matter. The audiovisual media apparatus is the condition of possibility, the media a priori, if you we might call it, of both the object and the genre itself, identified as Holocaust testimony. According to Laub, bearing witness to trauma is facilitated by the recovery of an empathic listener, who comes to partially participate in the reliving of the traumatic experience. The listener is fundamental to the process, serving an interpellative function by presenting himself or herself before the witness as an open and supportive recipient. As Shoshana Feldman puts it, it takes two to witness the unconscious. Or as Laub puts it, the listener, and I quote, takes on the responsibility of bearing witness that previously the narrator felt he bore alone and therefore could not carry out. End quote. The listener thus performs a meiotic function, midwifing the emergence of a narrative whose telling has been impeded by the pains of survival. The listener acts as a restorative addressee, as a Tao in Martin Buber's terms, thereby making bearing witness a profoundly dyadic process. But then there is another witness to the witnessing process, the video camera, bearing witness to the listener's bearing witness to the witness. If the listener as second witness facilitates the testimony of the first, the audiovisual technology as the third witness on scene facilitates the entire process of witnessing. Indeed, it is for the sake of recording that the testimony dyad came together in the first place. The camera acts as a surrogate audience for the survivor, providing the potential of numerous addressees. Jeffrey Hartman comes close to this realization when he suggests, invoking the sociologist Maurice Halbwachs, that the video archive constitutes what he calls a provisional affective community for the survivor. If for Halbwachs, affective community meant the immediate social ties and common experiences from which collective memory emerges, in Hartman's rendering, it is the apparatus of the archive that doubles as the enabling context for the construction of a remembering community. It doesn't take just two to bear witness, but the promise of a whole congregation. The third witness provided by media is therefore integral to the witnessing scene. As opposed to confidential therapy, testimony is conceived from the outset as public speech in potentia. Rather than dyad, I would say, the testimonial process comprises of a triad. If the listener acts as the Buberian Tao, The camera and the recording device act as what Emmanuel Levinas called le tiers, the third, the always already third party. Just as society begins with the presence of the third person, testimony commences with the attendance of media as third witness. The American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce's concept of thirdness is instructive here. If firstness is the quality of feeling as distinct from any objective conditions, and if secondness is externality as experienced by means of resistance and reaction, thirdness, he says, is the medium connecting, medium or connecting bond between absolute first and last. Thirdness is what joins first and second, inside and outside, while remaining independent of both. Hence, whatever involves mediation and representation involves thirdness. This tripartite scheme applies directly to the testimonial process. Traumatic experience might here refer to firstness. The enabling witnessing by the listener is secondness. And the media context of testimony is thirdness. Thirdness entails generality and distribution, the birth of style and convention, as well as the conditions for comparison and judgment, indeed what we've been doing here. Thirdness is what makes testimony profoundly public. Now, the video camera and the attendant recording device do not bear witness in the same way that human eyes and ears do. Capturing acoustic and optical effects of reality, they are unselective inscription devices. What they put on record are both intended and unintended expressions, the narrative together with the minute incidents accompanying its telling, the data and noise of testimony. The significance of the decision to use audiovisual technology rather than transcription or voice recording cannot be overstated. For what this media choice enables is direct access to, again, to what Hartman calls the survivor's embodied voice. That is, the speaker's distinctive cadence and tone, together with the puncturing gaps, halts, prior practices, and silences that coincide with bearing witness. Audiovisual recording picks up these haphazard cues and allows for their replaying and analysis. Videography is thus the sine qua non for the study of the performing of trauma in testimony. In Lacanian terms, this technological mediation registers what is left outside the realms of both the symbolic and the imaginary, namely the realm of the real. The real, to quote the German media theorist Friedrich Kittler, and I quote, forms the waste or residue that neither the mirror of the imaginary nor the grid of the symbolic can catch, the physiological accidents and stochastic disorder of bodies. End quote. The audiovisual then bears witness to the crisis of testimony by mediating the vacillations of narrative in giving an account of trauma. It is perhaps because of the embeddedness of audiovisual media in the scene of testimony that Laub never mentions them as such. Yet the media of witnessing interestingly crop up, usually by way of metaphors. Displaced from their original function, they are conjured to describe the inner workings or unworkings of human memory. Consider Laub's seminal essay in Testimony, in the book Testimony, on the vicissitudes of listening, which begins with the memorable phrase, an important phrase, a record that has yet to be made. Indeed, records and recording are a consistent preoccupation in my mind in Laub's writing, while their exact reference remains productively ambiguous. Here is how Laub describes massive trauma, and I quote, "The observing and recording mechanisms of the human mind are temporarily knocked out, malfunction. Hence the challenge of the listener is searching for an experience whose registration is still pending. As said, a record that has yet to be made." Record, the word record, is sufficiently ambiguous to be read as the outcome of a psychoanalytic process by which an event is to be retroactively restored, but equally as the actual record, the video recording capturing the process of restoring the missing mental record. a record by which the testimony may also be retroactively replayed. Indeed, the two senses of record are inescapably linked. The technological observing and recording mechanisms work as restorative prosthetics for the once blocked mental observing and recording mechanisms. In short, testimony is the search for a missing record on record. Another suggestive media metaphor is screen. Testimony, to repeat, replay. Testimony is the search for a missing record on record. Another suggestive media metaphor is screen. Laub asks that the listener act, and I quote, as a blank screen on which the event comes to be inscribed for the first time. Since Freud, of course, screen has been a key metaphor in describing the inner workings of human memory, particularly the twofold mechanism of projecting one kind of memory and covering up another. In Laub's case, the screen is external to the person doing the remembering, that is, the witness, and is embodied by the listener, the second witness. But then again, there is another screen on the witnessing scene, and this is, of course, the television screen. And it is, in fact, upon this screen that the event of remembering comes to be inscribed in the first place. The third witness of media provides the audiovisual milieu for both second and first witnesses bearing witness. So observing mechanisms, recording mechanisms, screens and records are all telltales of the media context of testimony. But on a deeper level, these media metaphors bespeak an underlying correspondence, I believe, between video testimony and psychoanalysis as two interconnected methods for inscribing trauma. To be sure, the visual channel, if you could say that, of video testimony introduces problems foreign to the strictly audio channel of the talking cue. It will be remembered that for Freud, psychoanalysis is based on the separation of sight and sound. Analysis proceeds by having the analysand lying and speaking without direct contact, eye contact, and the analyst sitting in the back noting the speech, but also the halts, slips, and digressions in the flow of speech. Video testimony invokes the time-honored auditory bias of psychoanalysis by basing itself on what Hartman calls a counter-cinematic integrity. That's how he puts it. While showing, it attempts to divert attention from what is shown to what is heard. It makes the image auxiliary to speech. Curbing the visual was indeed one of the first challenges of this enterprise. As Hartman affirms, after experimenting with different types of camera work during interviews, the decision was to give up, and I quote, the expressive potential and remain fixed, except for enough motion to satisfy more naturally the viewer's eye. We were not filmmakers, Hartman continues. Our technique, or lack of it, was homeopathic. It used television to cure television, to turn the medium against itself, limiting even while exploiting its visualizing powers. End quote. In making the image an extension of the voice, video testimony acts as an audiovisual amplification of the puncturing details of speech. The audiovisual serves to register the performing of trauma, capturing the witnessing body as its ultimate referent. Consider again Laub's often cited depiction of a woman recounting her memories of the uprising in Auschwitz. Laub describes her as slight, self-effacing, almost talking in whispers, mostly to herself. But then, a sudden intensity, passion, and color were infused into the narrative. She was fully there. All of a sudden, she said, we saw 4 chimneys go up in flames, exploding. Laub then recounts a debate following the screening of this testimony at a conference where the attending historians disqualified the testimony, claiming that historically, only 1 chimney was blown up, not 4. Insisting on its importance, Laub argues that what the woman was testifying to was not empirical history, but something more radical, an event that broke the all-compelling frame of Auschwitz. What the historians fail to acknowledge is the performative aspect of testimony, the timbre and cadence of voice, gestures, expressions, and nonverbal cues, which arguably convey a more profound meaning than the merely historical. In challenging the historian's judgment, Laub effectively challenges their conception of what constitutes a legitimate historical record, a position that relies on the technological capability to record and reproduce spoken words together with their accompanying indexical markers. The debate between the psychoanalysts and the historians can be read as underwritten by their respective media of record. Ultimately, I think, recording seems to serve for Laub a double redemptive function, restoring survivors' lost personal record and instituting historical record for future generations. And I quote again Laub at length. Video testimonies of genocidal trauma are a necessary part of a larger historical record, as well as the individual release from entrapment and trauma. The experience of survivors may be the only historical record of an event that has not been captured through usual methods of historical record and public discourse. Of course, I emphasized record. But if video testimony is the source and resource for a new historical record, it is because its record holds something that can never be fully narrativized. Recording bears witness to the gap between the spoken and the unspoken, between the symbolic and the real. And if the real always returns to the same place, as Lacan used to say, that place might be caught up somewhere on tape. Now, these media considerations are equally critical, perhaps even more, when it comes to Laub's more recent testimony project. For the last 15 years, Laub and his colleagues have been recording the testimonies of chronically hospitalized Holocaust survivors in Israeli psychiatric institutions. It is a relatively small collection, numbering in about 25 or 26 testimonies. In contrast to the Yale project, where filming was done in a studio or in class on campus, the filming of hospitalized survivors is conducted in the psychiatric ward. This places Laub in a long tradition of introducing cameras into mental institution, as Daniel already mentioned, which goes back to the 19th century and to figures like Charcot. For Charcot, photography provided a means to get as close as possible to an objective description of mental pathology, serving simultaneously experimental, taxonomical, and didactic functions. The tradition continued by other means in the 1960s and 70s with the introduction of closed-circuit television and video recording into psychiatric training and treatment. Videotape proved valuable in allowing both therapist and patient to watch and analyze recorded sessions. Videotape replay supplied a feedback mechanism for the therapeutic process. To quote one of the enthusiasts of that system in the 1970s, the use of video both compels the therapist to see more of what goes on non-verbally than he had previously realized and demands of him an increasing alertness to the non-verbal signs and communication which are ever present. End quote. Audiovisual media opened up then a non-symbolic channel into the manifest reality of mental pathology, realizing an almost unbounded interpretative potential of numerous reproducible moments of psychological behavior. The videotaping of hospitalized survivors shares some of the characteristics of traditional videotape techniques in psychiatry. The introduction of cameras into the ward, the integration of recording into the session, and the attention to non-verbal and paraverbal expressions are among the obvious ones. In some cases, there were even shared viewings with survivors in a similar vein to the aforementioned technotherapeutic feedback mechanism. However, there are profound differences that I think set Laub's project apart from the previous psychiatric use of videotape. First of all, the ultimate goal of interviewing and recording survivors is not strictly therapeutic. Recorded sessions are not part of an individual treatment program. They are not produced as a diagnostic tool, strictly so, for the use of the psychiatric profession. the potential audience envisioned, I think, is much broader. Psychotherapy is what opens the door for Laub, but not what keeps him there. The camera is employed as a redemptive rather than a surveying medium. The confidentiality of the session is breached from the outset in favor of public exposure. Laub's combination of media and psychiatry diverges from that of his predecessors in that what is at stake for him are historical and moral concerns more than merely clinical ones. It is worth lingering for a moment on the use of the word itself, testimony, in this project, in recorded interviews with hospitalized survivors, for I think it is far from obvious. It does not take more than a few viewings to see that the interviews collected in mental hospitals are very different from those collected at Yale. So different, in fact, that one could even question whether these are testimonies at all. It is for this reason that the equivalence, the implied equivalence, of testimony between the Israel Video Testimony Project and the Yale Testimony Project is nothing less than dramatic. For what this suggests is a profoundly revisionist, perhaps even revolutionary, and I will try to offer you this hypothesis, understanding of testimony. If this spasmodic narrative of hospitalized survivors are on a par with the generally articulate narratives of the so-called normative survivors, if the two join to form a unified category, then the result is a thoroughly unsettled notion of testimony and of the effect of trauma upon it. I would like to discuss only one testimony from this collection, which I think exemplifies some aspects of it. It is the testimony of Rafi Rakovsky, mentioned also yesterday, a child survivor who was briefly an actor at Israel National Theater Habima before hospitalizing himself in a psychiatric institution where he remained pretty much until his death. Until recently, this testimony was kept together with the rest of the project's testimonies in Dori Laub's basement. And I will return to this kind of archive basement shortly. So let's watch a segment from this very long testimony, and I will then...
בתור ילד אז היה לכם הרגשה של העורף, של אנשים נראים או...
כמעט זאת תעודה, תעודה כמעט.
תעודה. מה הזיכרונות הראשונים שיש לך לפי מוקדמים?
שום אמריקה.
גם לא מיוחד, אנחנו לא...
לא, אין לי שום זיכרון.
שום זיכרון, מילדות ארוכה. אוקיי, עכשיו, יותר נחמד, אבל קצת על זה אתה מוכן לדבר. מה הזיכרונות הראשונים שלך בתוך מלחמה? איפה אתה רואה בתוך מלחמה? הזיכרונות שלך, מה המלחמה? מה הזיכרונות הראשונים? איך נמצא בחדר, באמצע מישהו, מה...
אני במנזר.
במנזר. כלומר, אבא לקחו, אמא...
אתה במקום אחר.
אתה במקום אחר? לאיזה מקום? ידוע לך?
בתת-פי.
תת-רבי זה בערים?
נכון.
שהייתה הסתתרה או שמרה?
בעבר, בבית חולים חולה. יש לנו טוברקולוז, שחפת.
שחפת, כן.
טוברקולוז.
בתור עוזר או אחות?
עוזר.
עוזר. ואתה במנזר. מה אתה זוכר במנזר?
היה בסדר.
כן, אבל כמרים, איך זה היה בהרים, זה היה...
המנזר לא היה בהרים. היא הייתה בהרים. אני הייתי באנצרמיסטית, אז זה מקום אחר, זה לא...
היה כמה רחוק ברצלאבה.
אין לי מושג, זה מרכז סלובקיה.
אתה יודע איך
נזירות.
והם לקחו אותך ברכבת או
כן, משמע.
אתה זוכר פעם ראשונה שראית אותם? את הנזירות?
רק נזירות ממש.
לא תהית?
לא תשמע.
יש כאן מוזכרת, אבל מה פתאום נשים ולבושו נזירות.
לא ידעתי שיש נזירות, אבל לא פעם ראשונה
הבנת שלוקחים אותך בשביל להסיר אותך כי יש סכנה?
כן.
ובעיניים של הילד, מה הייתה הסכנה?
סכנת חיים.
אני קצת אמשיך לשאול, כלומר, בדמיון, מה פחדת שיעשו לך?
לא פחדתי שום.
סכנת חיים.
לא הייתי מופתע.
מופתע.
מופתח.
אם הנזירות זה איש פתוח.
כן.
איך נראה היה המנזר? אנחנו כל יודעים עד איך זה מנזר. יש כל מיני צורות. פשוט לא הייתה חולה.
בית רגישו להגיד.
בית עם עולם מסביב?
לא.
בית במרכז העיירה או משהו נפרד? איך זה?
במרכז.
במרכז.
בסדר. כן, זה במרכז.
כי אתה יודע, פה בארץ בדרך כלל זה כמו נגיד בלטרון או אתה בסדר? בדרך כלל זה ככה קצת נפרד פה, שם זה היה...
הייתה נזירה שטיפלה לך לך יותר אישית שאתה...
לא.
כולם, לא היה קשר. אתה זוכר דברים שהם אמרו לך?
לא אמרו לי כלום.
טוב, היה סדר יום, היית צריך לעשות איזה דברים לעשות.
ללמוד ולעבוד. ללמוד ולעבוד.
Okay, so as you could see, the frame is of Rakowski in medium close-up. His voice is slightly muffled due to the distance from the microphone. The picture is grainy, and an on-screen timecode adds to the rawness of the image. What immediately stands out is the amount of turn-taking during the interview. The interviewers seem to do most of the talking, while Rakowski's answers rarely exceed a couple of sentences. This makes for a strangely acousmatic experience for the viewer, hearing Laub's and his colleague Iritz Felsen's voices without ever seeing them. Following the narrative here is an excruciating task. Perhaps narrative is not the appropriate word. If it were not to the interviewer's empathic yet persistent questioning, even these fragments would not have been enunciated. Rakowski sits with his head tilted back, looking at the interviewers obliquely. A recurring chewing-like tick hinders his already slurred speech. From the fragments arises a sketchy story. Pre-war childhood in Czechoslovakia, separation from parents at the age of 8, hiding in a monastery while concealing his Jewish identity, reuniting with his mother after the war, who later remarries, immigrating to Israel at the age of 15 with a group of Zionist activists, working on a kibbutz, a few years of marriage followed by divorce, short career as a stage actor, and more or less continuous hospitalization since the late 1960s. Whenever Laub asks him about his feelings, having had to endure such agonizing experiences, Rakowski's repeated reply is with equanimity, indifference. Rakowski's acting career draws the attention of the interviewers, who proceed to probe the mindset that allowed him to play the role of many different characters. It comes by itself, is his reply. But a recently published short memoir by a late Habima theater actor sheds some light on the parts left dark in the testimony, and I came across this short memoir earlier this year and immediately shared it with Dori because I think it's a very important piece. consider here. So this is the memoir. It is a Saturday night, a few hours before the play. The Deputy is about to start in Jerusalem. That's a play by Wolf Hochholz. In German, it's der Stellvertreter, right? The play deals with the Catholic Church's denial of the fate of the Jews during the Holocaust. So the cast of the play is waiting on a bus for the understudy playing Pope Pius XII, Rafi Rakowski. And when he fails to arrive, they finally head out to his apartment, where they find him in total disarray, lying on the floor naked, laughing inexplicably and spouting obscenities. On the way back from the apartment, they come by another actor who knows the part and is willing to take over. A few days later, they receive a phone call from Rakowski's psychiatrist informing them that he had hanged himself. Apparently he didn't, as you could see. So the story is striking, even if its accuracy is, of course, questionable. It is hard to miss the melodramatic element of an actor who as a child had been hiding in a monastery during the war, and years later, when about to play the part of Pius XII, being accused of ignoring the Jewish Holocaust, fatally breaks down. Remarkably, none of this comes up in Rakowski's recorded testimony. No less striking is the fabricated ending. Whether invented or based on rumors, the suicide of the psychotic survivor provides a climactic closure to the story, denoting what would seem to be an inevitable fate, or perhaps a wish fulfillment on the part of the narrator. Obviously, Laub and Felsen did not know about the details presented in the story when interviewing Rakowski. Had they known, would it have changed the course of the interview? Would such knowledge have served listening to Rakowski? Knowledge has a precarious status for the listener. Knowing about the witness or the event depicted might actually hinder listening. As Laub claims in testimony, it might be useful sometimes not to know too much. In the case of hospitalized survivors who are long-time psychiatric patients, the precariousness of knowledge is even more acute. When watching Rakowski's testimony, a certain suspicion arises. Maybe he's acting all along. At one point in the testimony, he even says something to that extent. The question is never stated in the interview, but is nevertheless felt, certainly by the viewer, this viewer, and arguably also by the interviewers. All testimonies are plagued by factual errors and inconsistencies, but here it is the witness himself who raises the suspicion. Doubting a Holocaust survivor is a difficult feeling to bear, almost sacrilegious. While the viewer is left to deal with such feelings within the context of viewing, if the interviewer happens to feel that way, the entire interview would be affected. That the witness might be acting, knowingly or unknowingly, is likely to have crossed Laub and Felsen's minds. Other testimonies in this project might also raise suspicion as to reliability of the witness. Maybe they are too sick to remember. Maybe the long hospitalization muddled their memory. None of the testimonies of the hospitalized survivors is free from such questioning. Their condition as psychiatric patients inevitably plays into their believability as witnesses, and into the way both interviewers and viewers might relate to them. What then is the significance of the Israel Video Testimony project to the entire testimony and trauma discourse? What insights can the testimony of those on the far end of the continuum of witnessing, as Laub has recently put it, offer to the understanding of Holocaust testimony in general? Now, I cannot speak of the clinical contribution, which may well be considerable, but insofar as the media perspective is concerned, the project bears critical import. As with the Yale project more than 30 years ago, testimony requires an empathic listener, a second witness to facilitate the survivors bearing witness to traumatic experiences. In a time when numerous, or at least very many, normative, so-called normative Holocaust testimonies are being collected and disseminated through different projects, there are still, shockingly, Holocaust survivors who are not granted listening, who are denied the status of witness because deemed as having nothing to say. The Israel Testimony Project attempts to correct that wrong, even if belatedly, by providing a holding environment for listening to these testimonies, jumbled and spasmodic as they are. The consequence of thirdness, the media context of this project, are no less crucial. Audiovisual recording proved essential in detecting the distinctive trauma signature, as Laub puts it, marking these untypical testimonies. Seeking such trauma signature has been a dominant theme in the analysis of testimonies recorded at Yale, and we've talked about it. A signature unattainable, to be sure, without the unselective technical inscription of audiovisual recording. As Laub affirms, retroactive inspection of recordings from the Israel Testimony Project reveals a markedly different kind of parapraxis as compared to the Yale testimonies, and hence an entirely different manner by which trauma comes to inscribe itself audiovisually. But what it also reveals is a phenomenal amount of unconscious countertransference, of redirected responses toward the hospitalized survivors. Now, listening to traumatic experience no doubt entails the risk of countertransference, and I'm using the term countertransference more by way of a media perspective. So understood from a media perspective, countertransference could mean or could manifest itself as identification, especially when it comes to the more communicatively compelling testimonies. It could also manifest itself as resistance, which is precisely the case with the Israel project. Countertransference is not limited to secondness, but extends to thirdness, to the media-enabled conditions for social recognition. The testimonies of hospitalized survivors may well be described as the counter-model of the by now publicly accepted and documented testimonial genre. They are what I would call the counter-testimony of the popular or more popular Holocaust testimony. As such, they are bound to be rejected, as they unsettle the prevailing sense of how Holocaust testimony should look like. Questions about believability, as I just raised with respect to Rakovsky's testimonies, are one example of such resistance. Countertransference might take a more general form of public avoidance or dismissal. Yet the countertransference of what I call counter-testimony has implications not only for this relatively small collection, but to testimony, I would argue, in general. Counter-testimony puts the widely established variety or genre of testimony in a new light. It is as though Laub brings his recent project, the Yale project, to bear on. It is as though Laub brings his recent project, the Israel project, to bear on his earlier one, the Yale project, as a commentary on the existing testimony and trauma discourse to which he himself had been a key contributor, as if saying, notwithstanding previous discussions of the crisis of testimony, this is the true face of massive trauma. This is the ultimate crisis of witnessing. The lessons it sends is of the twofold problem of countertransference, identification with the conventional so-called normative testimony on the one hand, and resistance to the abnormal, non-conforming testimony on the other, calling attention to the risks of countertransference, both of the second and third witnesses, is, I would argue, the underlying motivation behind this recent project. With each of these testimonies constituting counter-testimony, combined together they form what I would call a counter-archive. As mentioned, the videotapes recorded in Israel had been initially denied deposit, and until recently were kept in Laub's basement. So just imagining that image, here resistance takes a most concrete, material form. exclusion from the archive, from the kind of testimonies worthy of archiving, indeed exclusion from thirdness. The basement archive is in this sense the counter-archive to the Yale archive, inaccessible and unwanted, just like the testimonies it holds. After a long postponement, the testimonies have finally been admitted into the Yale archive. And yet, I would ask, does the recent admittance mean the assimilation of the counter-archive into the archive? Will the counter-archive retain its exception to the rule of the archive? As Jacques Derrida argued, the archive, every archive, is both conservative and revolutionary. It preserves and safeguards, but at the same time institutes the conditions for archiving, the rule of the archivable. The archive does not simply store, but also shapes the very things it so stores. The Yale archive is no different. It was devised with the explicit intention of archiving something beyond the strictly factual, historical dimensions or of loss and survival. The result was an archive of trauma, literally. The archiving of the attempts and failures of narrative in giving voice to trauma. Videography captured the audiovisual effects of the witnessing performed by survivors, thereby giving expression to the performing of trauma. With the admission of the counter-archive into the Yale's depository, the archive expands to incorporate a most fatal strand of trauma, not just interrupting and puncturing narrative, but altogether damaging the possibility of its telling. The archive now stores, again to quote Laub, the far end of the continuum of witnessing, the point where testimony practically recedes from narrative structure. At the far end lie neither recovery nor redemption, only the incapacitating power of trauma. Now, in conclusion, I would like to take a different direction. And I would like to briefly perhaps, consider an emerging form of Holocaust testimony, which is perhaps the extreme opposite of the uncommunicative testimonies of hospitalized survivors. For lack of a better term, I would call it digital Holocaust testimony. The testimonies of hospitalized survivors end a latency period that included both the first and second generations to the Holocaust, reaching well into the third. And the media context of the third generation is what we call new media and hypermedia. Accessibility, searchability, and shareability are now becoming the matching properties of audiovisual testimony, like any other kind of online material. Digital media invite new opportunities as well as new challenges for Holocaust remembrance. Consider the cutting-edge project now being developed called New Dimensions in Testimony. It's a collaboration between the Shoah Foundation and the University of South California Institute for Creative Technologies. It's better to see this, so we'll watch a couple of minutes of this project and then.
What makes this project really unique and different is the ability to preserve an experience. And that's the experience of being able to interact and carry on a conversation with a Holocaust survivor. That's something that really hasn't been done, and it's what makes this project so revolutionary and groundbreaking.
The technology that we're working with the Shoah Foundation with, that we've developed here at the Institute for Creative Technologies, is trying to provide exactly that kind of effect. So we had this chance to work with Pinchas to record him, to be one of the first survivors ever recorded in this way, three-dimensionally, so that in the future, as we continue to develop holographic display technologies, we can take everything that he said, precisely verbatim, and place it projected into an environment where you can see it almost as if he's sitting right there.
So behind me is Pinchas Gutter, Holocaust survivor from Toronto in Canada. Pinchas was in the studio, and as you can see, he's waiting now on screen to have a few questions answered. Hello, Pinchas.
Hello.
So, why do you tell your story?
I tell my story for the purpose of improving humanity, if that's possible, even drop by drop by drop. You know, like a drop of water falls on a stone and it erodes a little bit and smooths it out. So hopefully by me telling my story over and over again, I will achieve the purpose of making humanity, or the world, a better place to live in.
This technology is very new right now, but of course, a generation from now, this kind of visual imagery and interactivity will be the norm for the next generation, and that's what we're preparing for.
One way to think about what we're doing is making real what's only been imagined in science fiction and movies before. What we're creating is that ability to have this conversation across time. So talking to somebody that lives now at some point in the future, ask them what you want to ask them and get what they say.
Do you remember any songs from your youth?
This is a lullaby that my mother used to sing to me, and I still remember it. It's in Polish. Jadą dzieci, jadą drogą, siostrzyczka i brat, i nawidzieć się nie mogą, jaki piękny świat.
When I hear about events such as the Holocaust, it sparks my curiosity. What are the causes? What are the consequences? And we know that's true for many people when they think about the Holocaust. New Dimensions in Testimony allows that dialogue to take place in which the questions that I have about the world in which I live can be answered directly, engaging me more and hopefully leading to a greater participation when we think about a world in which genocide continues to occur.
How old were you when the war ended?
I was between the ages of 13 and 14 when the war ended in 1945.
We're able to score each of the possible answers as to how likely it would be to be an answer to your question. And so we're able to decide if we have a close enough match, and if so, we give you that answer. If there is no answer that's good enough, then we can provide an answer that expresses that as well.
Feeling them be part of your own environment, lit by essentially the same light that you are, so they really feel present. There's this potential to be that much more connected to what they're saying, and to break away this frame that puts them in one place and puts you in another, and puts you in the same place, which is where all great storytelling can happen.
It's the next level we can go to for the future. We have to ensure that generations...
You get the idea, I think. Okay, clearly, the media context of testimony has gone a long way since the video camera and the videotape. A three-dimensional hologram of a survivor coupled with a voice recognition algorithm to simulate a conversation with future audiences is now, apparently, the state-of-the-art technology of testimony. However, it seems that in this project, that we've just seen, the third witness takes precedence over both first and second witnesses. Moreover, thirdness, the technical procedures for mediation and representation, is used to feign, to simulate secondness. The viewer becomes interviewer. My feeling when first watching this clip was deep uneasiness. And I have since tried to understand the source of my apprehension. While recognizing the many advantages that digital platform might have, I think that something fundamental is amiss here. What I'm calling digital testimony, or the technology that is behind it, obliterates, are precisely those incidental and accidental slips and halts, those unintended non-verbal cues along the narrative. In other words, what remains unsaid but is nonetheless expressed and captured through the audiovisual markers of trauma. It seems to me that as testimony transforms from analog to digital, and if this is any indication, and from narrative to database, trauma is removed from the archive. And it is for this reason that the testimonies of hospitalized survivors illustrate most starkly the challenge facing future mediation of Holocaust testimony, namely the growing accessibility of media on the one hand, and the persistent inaccessibility of trauma on the other. And what hangs in the balance is the shape of Holocaust testimony to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amit. I want to ask a question of clarification to begin with. You mentioned that the confidentiality was kept in this counter archive. But then we could see the recordings of Rakowski. And I want to ask, is it first after the death of these patients that you will give this material to the public? And then I would also be interested to hear, did the patients get the possibility to see the recordings so that you as interviewer and therapist maybe together with the patients as their companion in sadness, companion to trauma, could show something to them which they alone would not be able to see, so that the therapeutic value of these testimonies would be preserved, which would be one of the striking contrasts to these new endeavors of the Shoah Foundation, where the survivors have nothing, they have no gain of this, as far as I can judge. It's only young people who one fears that they would not be able to commemorate the Shoah otherwise than with the help of a fake survivor interacting on the basis of a recorded narrative. That the life embodied dimension is missing. Yeah.
So I should repeat the question? You were talking about confidentiality. Though it is perhaps better suited to answer some of the question, I'll just say that what I said is that the fact that it's being recorded, that the testimony is being recorded, means that at a certain point it would be public. Otherwise, there's no point in doing that. Now, the question is interesting because in the Yale archive, there is a legal limitation for anyone wanting to use or to watch or to analyze testimonies. You have to come in and you have to sign an agreement. And if you want to quote parts of the testimony, this has to be authorized by the witness unless they are not already alive. And then it's a kind of a public domain, we would call it now. The issue, as Doi would probably say, with the hospitalized survivors is different because there is a question of who's the legal guardian, right, to allow them to actually be interviewed. So the question applies to both cases in different ways. There's the tension of confidentiality in both contexts, but in different ways.
Would you like to say something to this?
I think we're not going to be able to resolve that, the question of confidentiality, except that each and every one, both in what Amit calls the Yale project and the Israel project, both all have signed releases permitting that to happen. In the case of the Israel project, it was with the consent of their legal guardians. So, basically, let's not forget that these are volunteers in the regular Yale testimonies and also among the survivors, or like 100 survivors and perhaps 18 volunteer to do that. So they want not beyond volunteering, in spite of Rafi's hesitance and not giving much. They stood in line in order to testify. So I think if we deprive them of the right, that is the real right to deprive them of, not the confidentiality. They want it to be
Something that seems to me to tie Rachel's piece to this one is the divide between knowing and realizing, and particularly I would say thinking of Lacanian real, right? So you have, narratives kind of delimit. They, you spoke of the unseen said. I mean, they repress as much as they reveal. But it seems that just the encounter with the real, in a sense, is what's most fulfilling. I think this is sort of what you're saying, that in a sense mental patients are the people closest to the leukemia. My uncle did a Yale testimony, actually, and his testimony is half mixed with the plot of Roman Polanski's film The Pianist, which he's a person of very clear mind, but he was taken away when he was 14. And I knew he had seen the film not long before he gave the testimony, and I know his story, so I can trace it through. But it seems not to matter. I mean, he, through telling that and the Polanski story in a way, he is encountering the full impact of these stories, and a sense that the specific story doesn't matter that much. It's the fact of listening. It's the fact of speaking to witnesses, and the fact of just having also kind of a safe encounter, safe because there is a witness there. He's someone who has nightmares, cannot normally think or speak about the Holocaust yet, and didn't for many years because his wife sort of forbade it. Shock, it's over. And then after she died, made the tape. And only there, I think, is he in a safe space to encounter it. And encounter it in the sense of the leukemia real, which the nightmares are too, but it's a very unsafe space. So anyway, I got a lot of this very rich talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I can just comment briefly that there is also a media significance to the so-called real here, because these are traces, right, of the effects that we're now, I would say, witnessing, continue to witness. So it works on multiple levels.
Thank you for an immensely rich presentation. I think that there are so many themes that I'll just list a few of those which I'd like to answer someday or discuss someday. I know that we will be here until 6 in this evening if we started. The first has to do with the uneasiness you had in front of the USC archive. And I had the same uneasiness, and my first reaction was, this is fake. That it is not that it is fake, I'm sure the man is expressing what he really believes, but it is clearly a performance. He is offering a performance with a beginning and end, a little song. Maybe if he were younger, he could have a few steps of dancing, but essentially he's giving a performance, and this performance is entirely willed. And that way it lacks the whole authenticity that I found in a situation where people are not being performing, but where they are submitted to a certain number of situations that reveal something. I think that this connects to a second point I wanted to make, which has to do with Jeff Hartman's commentary about we are not filmmakers, we are, we refuse to do expressive cinema and this type of discourse. I totally disagree with him. I think that this suggests that there's only one aesthetics of cinema, and it seems that it proves a very strong ignorance of theoreticians like André Bazin, who is one of the most famous theoreticians of cinema, and it's about the theory of
realism.
How important it is not to do anything, how important it is not to be expressive, because if you start being expressive, you prevent the object you're filming from being expressive, and expressiveness is not about you, it is about what it is being filmed. So I think that to me this is an essential issue which connects to the whole tradition of what I would call, and what you use the word, myotic cinema. Myotic cinema, of which cinema verite is just the translation. Myotic cinema consists in not showing things, in not being expressive, but in letting things appear. And I think that this is one of the most powerful tools of aesthetic cinema. It is not a lack of aesthetics, it is an aesthetic in its own right. Okay, third point, which I think deserves to be very much discussed, in the notion of the third level countertransference. You have these three series of levels, and that at each level you find some sort of you have a transference, then you have a countertransference, then you reach the media level where there's a third dimension of transference. At this point, this obviously machinery doesn't transfer. It's absurd. So what you mean by third level countertransference is that of a public. Either this public is made of spectators or this public is made of institutions, which means that at this point you are moving from personal psychology to some sort of a collective psychology where you use psychoanalytic categories to describe sociological issues. I think that this is very elegant, it is beautiful. Is it more than metaphoric? This is a question I would like to ask. Finally, in this series of questions, I think that what you described as the third levels is very much part of film theory. In that it is quite interesting that you have a certain film theory, and I'm sorry because this is my contribution to film theory, that you have situations where you have people who do things, and then within films you have people who watch people doing things. Okay. You have a character looking at another character doing something. And then this second character, in fact, is a platform allowing a third invisible character to enter the game. And the third invisible character is the spectator. Okay? Which means that level number 2 is just a preparation for level number 3. So I think that it is quite interesting that this sort of schema is already developed in very big detail in the different theories of suture. Okay, what is the relationship of third to second, and how does it work? Okay, and I think that I would like to finish on the interview that moved me most, which was that of Rafi Rakovsky. I think that for some reason, either because of Doris' choice, he only showed me certain videos and not the others, or by by accident, but I think it was a choice. I saw Rafi Rakovsky and Shmuel Ben-Meir, both impressed me very much. At one point you said, asked the question, is Rafi Rakovsky faking us? Is he really in that state of unreaction, or is he pretending to be an unreactor? And being a famous actor, he had been famous in his own time, he was able to fake it, to somehow let us believe that he did not care, that it was irrelevant, unimportant, and unempathetic. I think that it was, what I believe is that I'm not able to answer. I can answer from the counter-transfers, that I saw the irritation of the interviewer. But I can also tell something which seems to be quite important, that Rafi Rakovsky is equivocal. It is not, I'm not sure whether he's acting, and I'm not sure whether he knows he's acting. I think that his situation, what I mean, is that if you take Irving Goffman seriously, okay, I am acting right now.
This is what he actually says in the testimony.
Yes.
Everybody's acts.
Everybody's acting.
This is what he says.
And so he is acting, but the question is, what sort of acting is going on?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, Goffman says there's a difference when anybody makes a sentence between the man who's the author of the sentence and the man who's the animator of the sentence and gives its feeling, and the man who's responsible for the sentence. And I think that at this point, the archive forces us to distinguish between these levels. Where is he acting, and where is it coming from him? And I would like to finish on Rafi Rakovsky because, again, I noted a little detail. When he tells about the story of his life, he's very proud of having played one part. And he refers to it very specifically. That part is Harpagon. Harpagon, if you know French literature, is the play by Molière called The Miser, and not the imaginary. It's The Miser, and I went to read The Miser in reference to this particular situation, and there's a situation where the miser is asked, is there someone, he always believes that some people are stealing from him. And so someone asked him, do you have any inkling as to whoever is stealing from you? Who is doing the stealing? Who's the thief? And Harpagon answers, well, you should arrest everybody in his house, and you should arrest everybody in his neighborhood, and if possible, everybody in the town. The whole town is stealing from me. I think that to me it was quite interesting. Look now at Mr. Rafi Lakovsky. You know, he has been in the worst possible circumstances, but he says people were okay. They were like everybody, and nobody happened to me. It was nothing special. It was not horrible, etc. And when he goes on stage, what happens? He plays Harpagon, and he plays this guy who wants to indict the whole city. I think that it seems to be quite interesting to find the way, the balance that exists between his capacity of expressing himself on the stage and his total capacity of expressing himself when he was facing Dobby. And I thought that at that point, again, we have something that is totally absent from the next generation of testimonies. The man who believes that singing a little song would do it.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I have to interrupt you, but the group of students is waiting outside. They wait for teaching, so we have to leave the room as fast as we can and continue the discussion in the basement cafe where we now have lunch. Thanks again.
Thank you.